Hello, today is Tuesday, February 26th. This is the standard SIG cluster lifecycle meeting. Our agenda is kind of light today. If you have topics that you'd like to discuss, please add them to the meeting notes. Also, if you could add your details to the meeting minutes, that would also be helpful. Starting us off, Alexander, you wanted to talk about KubeCon China.
Yes, so the previous meeting we were discussing what we submitted were proposals for intro and deep dive sessions for KubeCon EU, and we don't have anyone yet for China. So I chatted offline with Di Shu, the person with whom I did the previous KubeCon China talks, and both of us practically volunteering to do for the next KubeCon China 6 sessions. So that's what I wanted to say.
Is there anyone else that wanted to do sessions for any of the other sub-projects for China? Like Justin, are you going to do a COP session for China?
I don't believe any of the COPS maintainers are going to China, as far as I know.
Okay. I just saw Thomas join. Thomas, do you know if anyone is going to do a Minikube session at all for China? You're on mute if you're trying to talk.
He might not have been fully connected, Tim.
Thomas, can you hear us? Or can you, do you know if anyone is going to be going to KubeCon China for Minikube sessions?
Yes, I've offered to give a talk there.
Okay.
Accepted.
As a SIG, we have time to do intro and deep dive for any of our projects and sub-projects. So it's pretty much a somewhat guaranteed slot. So if you're interested, can you please add details to the meeting notes, and we'll contact you offline about coordinating to get that squared away for logistics.
Yep, I will go ahead and do that.
All right. I think I will sync up with the other folks too after the meeting who are not here, unless Antoine magically shows up, to see who else might be able to do intro or deep dive. Next up is a topic I just wanted to get a brief TLDR update on, and maybe it's mainly for Justin and myself, but everyone should be aware of it. I don't have any updates, but I wonder if you're more connected to all the other people who are Googlers who are very interested in the CRD lifecycle problem. Do you know if there's any updates to that?
As far as I know, we have not. We are basically punting on anything that needs to be CRD and turning it into a core API where it's possible, which is not ideal. I think there are other issues, there are other feature gaps with CRDs that mean that even if we were magically to solve this issue, even if we were magically to solve the lifecycle management or CRD management issue, we wouldn't necessarily push everyone to use a CRD yet. I think in terms of our CRD installation topics, my personal view is if we just say, like, here's a manifest with the CRDs and any controllers if you need them, and then we make sure that that manifest works with kubeadm, works with cluster API, I'll make it work with COPS. I think that would be sufficient. I think the bundle is a good approach there, but orthogonal. So I don't know what your view is, Tim.
I don't have strong opinions. I didn't like any of the options we presented. That was my only strong opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, and from that I agree, and I think that was the, like, just do the manifest was the null option, right? It's like, don't do anything.
So but it needs to probably be addressed as a SIG within the 115 timeframe. Maybe our next meeting we can, if we have sort of meta topics that apply to the whole SIG, we can start to maybe get people rallied around execution on some of these things, because that one is thorny and affects everything.
Do people have context on this? Do you want to tell everyone what it's about?
Sure. the TLDR is that we want the core federated API management of CRDs requires a lifecycle management that they don't want to maintain inside of the core API anymore. So they basically want to break apart core API objects eventually in the long term and manage it the way you would manage everything else as sort of like an add-on, if you want to think of it that way. And because of that, we need to be able to think about lifecycle management of these things. And we haven't really thought about the problem at all, to be honest. But we need to address that issue probably in the 115 cycle and get a sort of a small strike force or working group to potentially find a happy landing at home for this. And maybe we kind of promote bundles to be a sub-project that owns this as part of that process.
I think also that today the requirements are fairly unclear. Like if it was just the case that, I think, what was it, storage, something with CSI node info, for example, is the one we were talking about, but have now made a core API, or going to make a core API. So sure, we can install those via an add-on, but are there requirements specific to CSI and specific to the Bootstrap that make that insufficient? In other words, it has to be installed first or something like that, or installed early. And what are the guarantees? I think it's a sort of two-way street. Like, what are the guarantees we can provide? And are those guarantees sufficient for the various consumers? And where they aren't, that's where we have to deal with it.
Yeah, it becomes really weird depending upon, we need to manage core APIs as a thing outside of the API server. And that's going to be really weird and thorny because it's a weird chicken egg problem. We need to make sure that everything is up and running from a cluster lifecycle perspective, from a Bootstrap standpoint, before we can actually say that a cluster is conformant of some kind.
That should be the new name for our SIG chicken egg.
I had a question. I know this was talked about, maybe it's SIG Arc, I forget, somewhere. But is someone from SIG Apps participating in this discussion?
They are, but this is different than apps. This is core API.
I understand that we could view it that way, but CRDs are not. I'm sorry, you said core API, not cluster lifecycle.
So it's weird. I admit, like it's very like strange problem to think about because we've traditionally not managed CRDs in this way. But these are basically how to make sure it's almost like schema versioning to bootstrap the core API server.
Sure. I mean, so the observation I have is that so the CRD functionality exists and people use it. Whether we categorize the way they use it as an add-on or as an application is not germane to the fact that they are using it, and it would be nice if there was a cohesive way for people to, a pattern for people to follow when they use CRDs. I don't think it's a cluster lifecycle a unique problem, right? It's not, I mean, I think this is genuinely applications can do this.
For applications, yeah, but it gets into this weird, you're basically falling down the rabbit hole that we all fell into when we first started talking about this. You get into the state space where you have all the tools for cluster lifecycle stand up a cluster, right? But the problem is, if you start federating the core APIs, what have you stood up? You haven't even stood up anything that's functional at all, right? So you get to this point where you need to actually do some level of post-process on initial bootstrap that actually gives you a functional cluster. Because without that base core API schema add-ons, or whatever you want to call them, you don't actually have a cluster that works.
So I understand. I don't think it's a black or white issue, though. I think there's a gradient of functionality. And so you could have a cluster that works for infrastructure engineers, and you could say, well, but does it work for my developers? Well, maybe not. Maybe I need Knative installed, right, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess I don't want to rabble on this here. My hope is that we have engaged with SIG Apps, and the solution we pick hopefully either works for them or leads them in a similar direction, so we don't have two parallel universes for how we deal with CRDs.
For what it's worth, I did everything in my power to try to punt this out of Sync Cluster Lifecycle. Because I did not want to own this, but it keeps on coming back to us. So the you sound like you're very interested in the problem domain. So maybe when we start planning for 115, maybe you want to tag along with the fun nerd fight on what it means to be a chicken egg instead of bootstrapping with CRDs.
Sounds enjoyable. I look forward to it.
All right. So how about next session? We start doing a 115 meta planning with this group, and that's one of the topics that we'll have to address. Next up, Justin.
I just inserted this. So about 2 meetings ago, we did I put a kept for add-ons link. I have neglected this and let it fall off my radar, but I guess we will. I just put it in because it feels very related to what we were just talking about, and that the add-ons are also likely to use a bundle, maybe. So ideally, we'd be able to use the add-on system the same way, with TBD though. And so I put that on there. Please do comment on it, and I will also update it, and maybe we could review that in our next review that properly in our next meeting. Thank you.
Any questions for Justin on that one?
I believe there are already pending comments that I have to address, so thank you for this.
Next up, we have a community update to give this week. Unless there's any other topics that folks want to discuss, we could just do the run-through, the standard run-through of updates that we want to present in the community meeting. Any other topics?
Time period? Sorry, when was our last update?
We do them kind of quarterly-ish.
Okay.
All right. So Robbie's not here, so Jason, do you want to give a brief TLDR?
Yeah, so for Cluster API, some of the highlights is we've been working out how to handle releases and release versioning and associated Kubernetes versioning. There's a link doc in the notes there if you're interested in providing some feedback. We've also recently added support for a cascading deletion. So now when you delete a cluster object, it will delete the associated machines. There is still some follow-up work there to support machine deployments and machine sets, and I've linked to the issue there for tracking that work. We've also, we're getting ready to land delete policies for machine sets. I've linked to the PR, and what that allows for is it's going to allow for integration with the Kubernetes autoscaler. By default, the policy will just delete a random machine, but there's also a newest and an oldest policy supported as well. And just kind of a rundown of status for V1 Alpha 1. We currently have 22 open issues, and we're looking at trying to deliver March 29th. So please feel free to take a look at any issues you may be interested in, help contribute. Out of those 22 issues, we have 4 that are priority long-term, so we can bump those if needed. And we currently have 7 that are lifecycle active, so we have plenty of open tasks if anybody's looking for something to do.
There's also a document related to the release and versioning about automated release process as well, which I added the link to.
At some point, maybe again in the next meeting, we should go through and add an agenda item to talk about what it means to release all these massive plethora of subprojects that exist, and how can we unify some of that release mechanics across all the subprojects to simplify everyone's life.
Yeah, that'd be great. I've got a lot of things going on right now, but if we put it down for next week, I can have some things to say.
Yeah, it's T-minus 2 weeks, and I think that'll be enough time for folks to think about it. I did have a question with regards to the deletion of machine sets, especially when doing it at a grand scale. Do folks? I didn't look through the PR, but just a quick question of whether or not folks had thought about using disruption budgets on deletions.
We've discussed it at a high level, but we really haven't dug into the implications or the complexity for it.
Question on that: if we drain the nodes, do we get it for free? You know, via like the tail wagging the dog type thing?
You do indirectly, but there's also weird kinds of infra problems that can exist when you delete a bunch of things. So long as all the workloads have here's the problem: everybody uses properly. So if you enforce some standard policy, you know, about disruption budgets on the machine deletion, you can kind of do a graceful thing, just like a and you could also offer a force if you wanted to. And it's also been asked by a number of different people using Cluster API over a long period of time about wanting to make sure that they have a rolling deletion or update policy, so that way when they're doing updates, upgrades, or deletions, it's all in a rolling style fashion, trying to be as respectful to the infrastructure as possible.
Yeah, so I recently, because there was a new PR out to factor out the code for doing drain from kubectl itself into a reusable library, I created a action item or an issue on the cluster. Well, I did it under a cluster API provider, AWS, to track that as we do machine deletion to actually drain the nodes prior to deleting the machines, because right now, at least for AWS, we just kind of delete the instances underneath, and it's not really graceful.
Yeah, well, a drain is a given, like that should be part of the workflow. But I'm trying to think of like higher order disruption budgets for actual, like, you know, so not everybody respects disruption budgets on their pods. So having a disruption budget on the machine deletion itself or part of the machine sets would help to minimize the potential blast radius when a person decides to do an upgrade or a deletion of a certain number of nodes in the cluster.
I'll make sure we have an item on the backlog to at least track that.
All right, that's awesome. Any other questions for Jason? Yes, no. Next up, Minikube.
Yes. So I wasn't sure exactly which time period to cover, so I tried to do everything for the quarter. Thankfully, most of the important stuff has been pretty recent. So we released 034 with the new interface, lots of stability fixes, consistent IPs, initial support for language localization, and a little bit more on that later. We did suffer regression with when we pulled in a new version of libmachine, where it, on AMD processors with VirtualBox, it says they don't have virtualization enabled. So we're working with upstream to get that fixed. We did just introduce a proper abstraction layer for container runtimes. We've had support for alternative container runtimes for a long time, but it was very hacky. So 1.0 will be really the first release where Cryo will be a first-class citizen, Containerd as well. So we're basically into the final sprint for 1.0 to be released in about 3 weeks. There's a link for issues. If anyone's interested, they should be all marked as, you know, good first issue or help wanted. So our focus for 1.0 is documentation, integration testing, and auto detection of configuration issues. Proxies being probably the biggest configuration issue that we face. People have all sorts of very interesting HTTP proxies that block access to the internet, and that's always exciting for us. So we've also started talking in our last office hours on post 1.0 discussions, where we're basically focused after 1.0 on how do we make Minikube usable by the next billion users. You know, the next set of people who has never used Kubernetes, they're using Minikube as a way to learn how to do Kubernetes, and they're not necessarily system administrators yet. So we basically would like Minikube start to work for everybody with no flags required. And if there's any dependencies or system configuration issues that need to get resolved, it should offer to, you know, handle those. Like, would you like to download HyperKit? Or, we noticed your HyperKit is an old driver version, things like that. Language localization is going to be very big for us. We plan on presenting in Shanghai Minikube in traditional Chinese. So that's something we've been prepping for. And also support for local image repositories. Right now, Minikube does not work out of the box in China because of access to kates.gcr.io for pulling images. There's been some discussions on how to resolve this. We're basically, plan at the moment is to add an image repository flag to switch to a local mirror. There are concerns about poisoning, concerns from me about cache poisoning, because all the images that are downloaded by KubeADM right now are by a version tag and not by a hash, as far as I know. So that's one concern, but that's it.
How do users get Minikube in China if they can't, where does that come from?
That's a wonderful question. So you can, I don't actually know how they're getting it. I've read some guides and I've seen it uploaded to some random websites internally to China. But a lot of our issues actually coming in are people in China trying to use Minikube with strange proxy configurations to work around the firewalls. We would like the experience to just be Minikube start. No fancy setup or flags.
So this kind of dovetails with that whole release mechanization question. we have release problems in general, and federating how we're going to do release semantics and some of those details across the subprojects is, we need to do that.
How can I help?
Maybe that's another topic for next time, and when we start doing planning for 115 cycle. To jump on your topic about issue triage, I as you asked a while ago, I wrote up a doc for the TLDR of how we do triage, and it's inside of the community repo. So if folks wanted to follow that, they can feel free to follow along. It's gotten a good amount of positive feedback so far from a bunch of different people. So.
Okay, I will check that out. Thank you.
Next up is KubeADM. I see Fabrizio's on the call. I wrote a couple of notes there, but if you wanted to give more of an update, that'd also be useful. The four major topics I have is the improved HA lifecycle, join phases, a lot of the work that Lubomir did to integrate kind as a default option for the builds and testing, and a number of bug fixes. Fabrizio, you want to embellish on any of that?
Yes, so P0 for this cycle was the test, and Lubomir is doing a great work in starting using kind as a tool for testing kubeadmin and slowly replacing kubeadmin anywhere. So we already have the first test, and we are starting to discuss how to tackle the upgrade test, which are the trickiest to do, but upgrade test will come, automatic upgrade test with kind will come the next cycle. P1 was improvement in HA, so we are continuing to slightly improve the HA. This cycle, the biggest improvement is the automatic copy of certificate from the first control plane to the secondary control planes, and so with this step we are removing the last manual operation that is in charge to the user, and that was really error prone, and there are also a set of minor improvement in handling the joining of the new etcd members. and we are in time with the timeline, but we want to graduate this feature during this cycle because the graduation is linked to the availability of tests. So it is pointed to the next cycle. And then during the cycle, we added a low priority goals that was to implement phases for the join. And those are the main things that we are working. We are well set to meet the deadline for the code freeze. I think that's all for Kubernetes.
Cool. Any questions for Fabrizio? Those who are working on cluster API providers, some of the automation around HA certificate copy, even if COPS eventually decides to use Kubernetes, that will actually be a lot easier for folks too as well for the HA management. Next up, COPS.
Yes, I tried to put on like the sort of highlights of the last 3 months. So the big one is that we're finally getting everyone to etcd 3. So hopefully we will never again speak of etcd 2. And I hope there is no etcd 4, but we will see. One of the interesting things we're dealing with right now is like the run C CVE, which is sort of interesting because we have packaged Docker. So I don't know if that makes COPS a distribution or whatever you want to call it. But the point being that it's something that the community hasn't really dealt with. And so that's one of the things that we're wrestling with and sort of the scope of COPS, I guess you'd say. But our roadmap is cluster API adoption, and hopefully we'll get Kubernetes through that. Moving to CRDs for COPS and add-on management. And sort of the real big picture idea is that we contribute to community projects and thereby are able to use those community projects and move as much COPS functionality into those community projects so that COPS itself becomes much smaller.
Any questions for Justin? I don't see Antoine on. I'll try to poke him to see if he wants to give an update for KubeSpray, and I'll try to do that asynchronously. By extension, Kind isn't necessarily a sub-project of SIG cluster lifecycle, but Ben is here, and if you want me to do a readout, because a lot of folks who work on the SIG also have a lot of interest in Kind and have thrown down resources and helped the effort there. Is there any updates that you'd like me to especially call out during the community meeting?
Let me think. So we have offline support working actually, which is pretty nice. I think we upgraded to Kubernetes latest 1.13.3 release. We're hoping to have a new release out soon, possibly later this week, looking at probably a monthly cadence. Fix some bugs, and we've started using it more in the CI.
When can I tell everyone that local cluster up is dead? That's the question I want to know.
When Dims is happy with Kind, I think he needs maybe 1 or 2 more things.
All right, I think we'll in this meeting maybe we'll like pop a bottle of champagne or something.
You should emphasize that it's not dead yet in the Monty Python sense.
Yeah. I'll wear the flamethrower jetpack or something, and try to burn something. Right. Are there any questions for Ben at all? Okay, I think we've got updates from everybody. Are there any more group topics that folks would like to discuss? Going once, twice, 3 times? Okay, so I think the only thing that I want to make sure that we follow up on is I will assign action items in the notes, and so we're armed to the teeth for our next conversation in 2 weeks, which will hopefully be a good time for us to discuss about 115 items in the great CRD migration path that doesn't go through the Oregon Trail. So it should be a fun one. All right. Take care. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye bye.